Okay, great.
Welcome to the Ontology Summit 2021. Today is April 14th, 2021, and I'm pleased to introduce Leia Dickerson, who is at the U.S. Government Accounting Office. So I hope to hear a very interesting talk about sustainability. Leia?
All right, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ken. My name is Leia Dickerson, as Ken said. I am a senior librarian at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and I'm here to talk to you about sustainability as it relates to a project that my colleagues and I are working at GAO, which is to just develop an ontology based on fraud. So what I'm going to do is I'll walk you through a little bit of background about GAO, who we are, talk a little bit about how the project came to be, and then I'm going to talk more about our actual process of our project and how it relates to sustainability. And then I'll conclude, and I look forward to having a discussion with all of you about what we're doing. So hopefully my slides will come through shortly. I'm sorry, we're facing some challenges with our email server at our agency. As we're waiting for that to go through, I will go ahead and just start giving a little bit of discussion about GAO. I can bring up our site as we're waiting for my slides to come through. And I'll share my screen. Okay, hopefully you all are seeing gao.gov.
Yes, we are seeing. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Well, so for those of you who are not familiar with our agency, we are the U.S. Government Accountability Office. We are the supreme audit institution of the United States. We are a congressional agency. We are also independent, though. We are in the congressional branch, but we are an independent agency. And we are colloquially known as the government watchdog. We are the ones that go through federal agency operations, federal agency programs and policies, and determine their effectiveness. We audit them. We see what particular issues there might be. And our ultimate goal is to provide the best consultation and support and information and advice to the congressional branch, primarily Congress, and also to federal agencies to help them improve their operations and their procedures and their policies, and then also to the public so they know how the federal government is operating, and to provide, along with that, the best value to the American taxpayer. We have a whole host of different products. As you can see here, we have reports and testimonies. We also, our Office of General Counsel is also involved in releasing quite a bit of information through things that are known as bid protests, which are bids and work related to the contracting that happens in the federal government, and when businesses provide bids on contracts and what kind of resolutions and conflicts come out of that. GAO is involved in that and is also involved in providing guidance on appropriations law. So there are two main teams, and I'm going to see in our email is still not doing. So I will share from inside VDI. Let me see if I can get this to work. I'm going to do something and see if I can make this work. So bear with me. So as I'm opening that up, I'm going to talk a little bit about the two teams that are mostly involved in this project that I'm talking about today. So there's one team. So let me start by saying GAO is divided up in multiple teams around the different aspects of our work. There are 15 what we call mission teams that are focused on conducting the audit work and evaluative work that our agency is tasked with doing. And then there are 16 operational teams that are supporting and running the agency and all of that work. So that includes staff offices like our Office of Public Affairs and our audit quality office that helps us with quality, and OGC, our Office of General Counsel, but also just operational units on the inner workings of our agency. So on the mission side, as I said, there are 15 teams. And the team that I am part of is the Applied Research and Methods team. And let me see if this will work. Okay, so I'm going to go on full screen. I'm going to see if I can share. Okay. Okay, can you see a PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Yes, it looks good.
One slide anyway.
Okay, yes, excellent. All right, so we're going to do it this way. Thank you for your flexibility, everyone. So our team, my team that I'm on, and then my colleague Stephen Patansu is also on, is the Applied Research and Methods team. And our team is dedicated to providing methodological consultation and expertise to all the mission teams and also the operations side of the house in conducting their work. There are 6 different centers within ARM, as it's known in GAO. We like to divide everybody up into different teams and working groups. So there are 6 centers within ARM, and I am in the Center for Library Services, and my colleague Stephen is in the Center for Design Methods. And 2 of those teams, along with the other 2 of those centers, along with other centers in ARM, are again providing consultation and expertise around methodology and conducting work in all of these different areas. And there are ones that aren't listed here that I know we also do work in. So again, a wide array of expertise in our team. Okay, and then the other main team involved in this project is FAIS. FAIS is the Forensic Audits and Investigative Service team. As the name suggests, they are specialists in forensic work. And when we say forensic audits, we're talking about the testing and evaluation of internal controls in a particular program or operation and policies and such procedures that are being carried out in a federal way or in a federal nexus or federal program for a federal agency. So really testing and seeing what issues there might be related to internal controls and making sure there's an integrity of process and information in a particular federal agency or federal program. As you can see, just like my colleagues in ARM, there are lots of different types of expertise within FAIS. And they also do operate FraudNet, which is a clearinghouse and a place for information for people reporting fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government and involving federal funds. And I think that's going to be a key part about how you're going to think about what we talk about when we mean federal in this project, involving federal funds. Okay, so one of the key projects and products that my colleagues in FAIS has produced over the past few years is the GAO fraud risk framework. And I was actually my colleague Stephen and I were actually both involved in this project several years ago. This guidance is really to help people think about fraud risk in their programs. As I just mentioned, the idea of a forensic audit, thinking about internal controls, like how do you have internal controls in your program? How do you evaluate and make sure you're addressing all of these concerns in your program, right? So you've heard me talk about fraud. You've heard me talk about fraud risk. And I just want to quickly give you some notes about that, because I think the public, or in a general sense, fraud means one thing, and you might not know how we speak about fraud in a very specific way. Here at GAO, we're very concerned about terminology and exactness and preciseness and how we're defining things. So it's really important to understand what fraud is. And fraud is about obtaining something through willful misrepresentation. Okay, so you're obtaining something of value through willful, so meaning intentional, misrepresentation. And another key part about fraud that I want to know when we're talking about it in this context, and this is going to come up later on in the presentation, when we're talking about fraud in our context, we're talking about something that has been decided and finalized. It's either gone through the judicial process in some way, or it's been adjudicated in some official procedure, right? So it's something that's happened. When we talk about fraud risk is vulnerabilities and possibilities and potentialities. It's not something that is concrete and certain. It's something that may have happened. There's a sense of uncertainty or potentiality or future event to it. Fraud is something that has happened. And we know that's happened because we've gone through the process of evaluating the facts of what occurred and made a determination based on it. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're, listening to this presentation. Fraud risk, fraud, they do have different meanings. And this guidance is really intended for fraud risk and helping program managers in the federal government to work through those issues. Okay, so yes, there's this guidance, and it was well received, but FAIS found over time that some issues were bubbling up. There was this guidance. It really helped federal managers become more aware of fraud risk and think about it and try to address it, but still there are additional steps that are needed, right? So one issue that came up is that agencies and inspector general offices use different terminology, statutes, and indicators. So basically, if you're thinking about the federal government, there's a large breadth of activities that happen, right? There's tax collection, there's regulation of transportation, there's management of art objects. There's a whole plethora of different types of activities that the federal government is involved in. So naturally, you're going to have different terminology talking about issues. You're going to have different statutes that are applicable to a particular operation or federal program. And you're going to have different things that are going to flag or, make someone scratch their head if something is happening in their program that may look like it has some risks to it. And then in addition to that, managers and programs, they're not going to have the full scope of everything that's going on, right? Something that we've really kind of explored in this project is the idea that fraud is cross-cutting, right? It's going to go all these different directions. And if you're a program manager, in the weeds in your particular program, you're not going to necessarily see the, the right and left of you of, oh, there's this thread that's connecting out here, right? You might not have all the resources you need, even if you do anticipate some of those threads going out to address all of it. You might think, well, I have this issue, but the IG, they're taking care of it. All of these different issues are things that lead back to, yes, people have this general understanding of fraud risk, but it's not really this deeper awareness and this deeper framework that people really need to tackle the issue. So this engagement, at the start was, well, what is the nature of federal fraud affecting the federal government? That was the initial question that started this project. And, when talking with the team, we decided, well, you know what? We're talking about the nature of something, right? We're talking about the nature of a domain, which is fraud that affects the federal government, not necessarily in the federal government, but affects the federal government, right? So an ontology, as a lot of you know, is really good about helping people parse out and understand relationships between concepts. And that's what we really needed to do for this project. We needed to understand what is going on in the federal government, or what is going on with federal funds, or what is going on with things with a federal nexus as it relates to fraud. And I am using the word fraud here versus fraud risk because our ontology was really developed by looking at federal fraud cases. And I'm going to go a little bit more into this a bit later, but we based a lot of our framework at looking at closed cases through a few different sources and saying, okay, what is going on here? What can we see that is percolating up from these things that we're seeing? So that's where we started, and a lot of what you're going to hear me talk about comes from, is looking at those cases and determining what's there, in addition to other resources and other methods. And the model that we've come up with, it's really helping us understand, okay, how is fraud connecting to different areas? How can a program manager or other people, involved in federal programs or federal operations, how can they think about how they're dealing with internal control based on what they're seeing in our ontology, and how can that help their understanding, their thinking, our measurement? There isn't really a lot of uniform language or measurement indicators for fraud in the federal government. Agencies put out reports, but there's no common, like, this is what this is and this is what that is, right? And then if you have a common sense of measurement, you can collaborate better with other agencies that might have similar issues to you or similar operations. And it helps you, break down your silo, your blinders on what your particular area that you're working on. So that's why we decided to pursue this project. Okay, so just to give you, the next couple slides are just to give you a sense of what our model is. Okay, so we came up with 4 main elements of what a fraud scheme affecting the federal government is, right? So there's the federal program or operation, and there might be multiple, but there's going to be some sense of federal nexus, and this could be a federal grant program, it could be visa issuance, it could be regulation of import goods, it could be all sorts of things that the federal government is engaged in, right? There's participant. So that's mainly the fraudster, so the person who's committing the fraud, but there are also two other main categories of participant. There's a facilitator, so who is letting this happen, and that could be someone who's in on it, so complicit, or unknowing. They just they're there and they're unaware of the illegal activity. And then there's, of course, a victim, okay, or multiple victims, and there can be all sorts of people and entities involved in the participant. There's the activity. And the activity in our team, we like to say it's the flavor of fraud. It's the sense, the breed, the dog breed, if you're a cat breed, animal breed, if you would use that analogy too, of what the type of fraud is. Is it grant fraud? Is it tax fraud? Is it coupon fraud? Is it asset misappropriation? Is it what is going on? What is the general sense of what is going on? And then there's impact. What are the externalities of what happened? Of course, the fraudster is affected, the facilitator of a victim, the federal program is affected, but there might be other things. There might be reputational impact on the program. There might be funds that go to other illicit activities. So there are lots of different things to think about as far as impact as well. So those are the things that we came up with as our key parts of the scheme. There are lots and lots of entities in our model, but I wanted to point out 4 other key entities, and they're all classes that play an important part of our model. One is mechanism. So mechanism and activity are kind of complement one another in some degree. When you think of activity is the flavor of fraud. It's the kind of a type of fraud. Mechanism are the tools that are used to do the fraud, right? So there might be tax fraud, but a mechanism might be false attestation and false statement and revised documentation or falsified documentation, right? So those are mechanisms. Or, a stolen password might be a mechanism. A stolen social security number might be a mechanism. Okay, so those are all things that are tools in order to execute a fraud. Funding stream and revenue stream are just ways of how the government intakes money and outputs money, right? So funding stream outputs money, revenue stream input money, and money and resources, right? So funding might not necessarily just be like cash. It might be providing of equipment or providing of resources in some specific way. So funding stream or revenue stream, just how resources and funding are coming and going. And then thing and role is really key for our talking about participants. So we really haven't, and this has been deliberate, we really wanted to be flexible about how we talk about what a participant is, because there could be some cases where a federal program is a facilitator of a particular fraud, or federal program is the victim of a particular fraud. There could be instances where a particular type of person, like an immigrant, could be a facilitator, or they could be a victim, or they could be a fraudster, or a government official. The same thing. It all depends on the scheme. So we use the thing and role construct, which is borrowed from FIBO, and we've done some tweaking with it to help us provide that flexibility to know that, yes, there are going to be different roles for different types of schemes, and we need that flexibility to switch in and out who is what and what is what, and given in a given particular scheme. Okay, so I'll run through this quickly in the interest of time. This is a fraud scheme example. My colleague Carla and FAIS has used this quite a bit in other presentations and other discussions about our model. So just to give you a quick run through, so Jessica Zhang and Ben Wen are going to be the fraudsters, the very participants. The federal program or operation is, the grant programs from the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and Department of Agriculture. The activity is grant fraud. And, the mechanism would probably be, false documentation, since they're applying to a grant program, or false attestation to what their, businesses are, or, what they're doing. And then impact, when you think about impact, well, the fraudsters were ordered to repay, and they did get some money. And then you can think of who were the people who didn't get grant money because these two fraudsters were able to get into the program. So just an example of thinking about how we're thinking about our model. Okay, so quickly switching gears. So the name of this track is sustainability, right? So we need to think about how sustainability applies to ontologies. When a lot of people think of the term sustainability, a lot of people either go to environmental sustainability or fiscal sustainability. But at the core, sustainability is just making sure a resource isn't being depleted, making sure it can be maintained or continued. The first definition is from Merriam-Webster. The second definition is from Oxford. So you can offer Oxford English Dictionary. So you can see slightly different flavors or slightly different connotations or discussions of this idea. But again, the idea that we want to make sure things are maintained so they don't get depleted, so they can remain in good order and in good health. So when we're talking about sustainability a little bit more specifically, we're thinking about there are three pillars that are part of it. There's the economic aspect, there's the societal or social aspect, and then there's the environmental aspect. I like this image because it shows that you can think about sustainability in two ways with these pillars. You can think about them as an intersection of various elements, or you can think about them as, subsuming one another. But economy is the very first, and then there's societal, and then there's environmental. And then, instead of, being overlapping and kind of building upon one another, overlapping with one another, they're actually kind of building on top of one another. So it's just showing two different ways of viewing how those elements interact. Okay, so how does this manifest itself in our project? Well, one, when you're thinking about economics viability, you're thinking about support, and that means internal support for our project. Well, our work is supported within the engagement structure. So as I mentioned earlier on, we have two main teams, ARM and FAIS, involved in this project, and we have different specialties within that. We also have a few other stakeholders that have been working with us on our engagement. There's an attorney, Sabrina, our attorney, who has been offering her expertise from our Office of General Counsel, dealing with some of the legal issues when we're looking at cases and helping us think through things there. We also have an engagement process where we do something called initiation, which is the very beginning and initial discussions. Then we have something called a design process where we do project planning and we provide documentation to internal stakeholders. That includes our team management, Office of General Counsel, other mission teams that are interested or have expertise to lend to our project. We have colleagues in our innovation lab, STAA Innovation Lab, working with us in addition on this project to help build a website that will present the content of the ontology along with some other pieces of content. So we're having a lot of internal discussions and a lot of internal discussions, a lot of collaboration internally, and that is our quote unquote economic support, our resourcing internally for this project. So pillar 2. So one of the key parts about GAO is that we are a nonpartisan agency. We have several frameworks built into our processes from an engagement or project level to a just day-to-day and weekly or bi-weekly level to provide structure and enforce that idea of impartiality and nonpartisanship. So that is a key part of GAO values, and we've carried that on, of course, through this work. We have also made sure that we are, of course, doing this work from a US federal perspective. Of course, we know that fraud doesn't always occur with a federal nexus. However, in order to keep our engagement focused and to make sure we are covering what is applicable and what we can really truly speak to and have the resources and bandwidth to address, we've really focused on things that truly have a federal nexus with the US federal government. That is not to say we haven't made had some thought about, okay, how can we write and construct this ontology so it's adaptable to others who are not US federal government entities. We've had discussions about that. We've thought about it and make sure that it could possibly be adaptable in some ways, but still maintaining the focus of this is on the federal government in the US. We need to make sure we're talking about things in that way as a primary concern and as a primary focus without losing that upper perspective. So in addition to our impartiality and kind of how we've been approaching this, we've of course engaged with others outside of our agency to make sure we're getting feedback and we're getting engaged with those people that are going to hopefully be using this and making sure that they are at the table with us and are able to provide important information for us to make this a usable and a sustainable tool for them. So we interviewed inspector generals, and inspector generals are, the auditors for individual agencies, right? So they are the quote unquote fraud experts in their particular areas of their agency. So they have a very specific perspective. And then we spoke to just federal agencies and focus groups and in interviews. And these are people who are program managers. They're specialists in their program area. They're not specialists in fraud. So it was really fraud and fraud risk. So it was really important for us to hear their perspectives about what their concerns were, what their needs were, and understand that so we can provide a useful information to them. We've also spoken to international counterparts. So FAIS Director Rebecca Shea has spoken with entities in the UK, Australia, Ireland, and Canada. I believe I have it correct. And in addition to other US officials. And then a few of us have also presented separately to a separate Australian government agencies. So we've gotten that international feedback as well, and engaged with people and just to see if how we're approaching things makes sense. We've also spoken to other groups. We received training from EDM Council, the creators of FIBO, on, they called it knowledge graph training, ontology training, during the course of our work on this ontology, and got their feedback and received feedback on our approach and how we're constructing this fraud ontology. So we've gotten lots of different aspects of information from people to, again, build capacity, build knowledge, and make sure the appropriate people are engaged with what we're doing. Okay, so additional approaches. So GAO is huge on documentation, huge. We are very much about documentation. So I mentioned earlier our fraud cases. So we took two main sources for going through fraud cases. We went through the Department of Justice press releases. They do press releases on pretty regularly on different cases that they are prosecuting or have received plea agreements on, other activities related to cases. So we've examined those to go through and identify cases to look at, and then have followed up by going to PACER with the assistance of Carla and Sabrina, have worked really hard on that. And then we've also went through semi-annual reports from Inspector General offices and identify cases that way as well. So those are the two main ways that we identify cases. Occasionally, we would find things that would bubble up in the news as well, and we would go and kind of incorporate those things as well. But we really did a lot of review of cases. The semi-annual report was a full content analysis. So really getting into the ways to be really sure that our model has validating our model through a content analysis and making sure there isn't anything we were missing. So again, just really documenting and making sure we're going through things in a really great way. We reviewed literature. We did do a search to identify anything about fraud typologies, fraud definitions in the literature. We found several articles that talked about it. We found some government and nonprofit reports and other great literature that talked about fraud in that more categorical sense and categorizing it and describing it and classifying it. When it came to our definitions for our entities, I, being a research librarian, am a stickler for resources. So I really pushed the team to use really great resources. So a lot of our resources were federal government agencies and looking at their documentation, looking at other, quasi-government agents, quasi-governmental organizations or other authoritative sources, like maybe for some of our healthcare definitions, we looked at the World Health Organization. As far as reference materials are concerned, we looked at Merriam-Webster a lot. We looked at Black's Law Dictionary. And then there are other assorted references that we came across. But again, the idea, we really wanted to use authoritative sources to use those, to develop those natural language definitions, to make sure that people that we're engaging are able to take our ontology as something that they can trust and they can invest in using. And we're in the latter stages of our work, but we're still going through that final editing and harmonization to make sure our definitions are what they need to be. So again, standards, very, very important. Again, in addition to being sticklers about documentation, we are also sticklers about standards at GAO. We engage or we do our engagement work according to internal standards and processes. This is not an official performance audit as it's known at GAO, but we are still doing a lot of different work to make sure our work is at a certain quality. For example, when we did our focus groups with federal agencies, there are specific guidelines that my colleague Stephen Patunsu, who is a methodologist, worked with the team to develop to make sure we were selecting and setting up those focus groups appropriately. And again, he and another colleague led those focus groups to, again, GAO standards. We have very specific procedures we do in order to carry out that work. And then, of course, ontology standards, right? ISO 704 has been great in guiding our thinking about writing definitions. Again, no circular definitions, making sure they're clean, really featuring the chief information that needs to be there and everything else going into a scope note. And then using FIBO. FIBO has a really great list of guidelines for inclusion for content in their ontologies. And we've been using that as well as a way of going through and checking and cleaning up and editing our ontology. Okay, so environmental protection. How do you maintain this? And this is where, there are a lot of questions here for us. We want this to be a living thing. We know that this is 1.0. And we are trying to think about these questions now. How is this going to be maintained? Who are we going to engage with moving forward? And, this is something we're actively thinking about right now. So one thing that we're working on, and that's an active project, active way of thinking, we are using our ontology as a schema for tracking active fraud cases. Now, you heard me talk about how, we really based our ontology on closed fraud cases for the most part. Well, we're now taking our schema and looking at active cases, things that are going through the judicial or adjudication process currently, and seeing how that can be used to track those cases and maybe do some light analysis on what we're seeing, okay? Things have been kind of bubbling up because of that. We're noticing things about the ontology, or have noticed things about the ontology and what we need to change. And we're trying to negotiate, okay, where's the dividing line between, yes, this needs to be a change with the ontology, and this is a thing to put in the parking lot for future iterations. Or maybe this is dealt with in a different way. So again, I mentioned trends, in addition to just like tracking active cases, over time, do we want to look at cases year by year and see if there's anything we can do there and providing some tracking? Also, we're thinking about, in addition to just like actively like testing and seeing how this can work, we're thinking about caretaking for the long term. So how do we internally build capacity to update this ontology? This engagement team, it's Carla, Nick, and Amber, our assistant director, Heather, our director, Rebecca, Stephen, and I, or Sabrina. We're not going to be on this engagement forever, right? There's going to be a point where this pauses and it stops and we go to another stage, another project. So we need to think about, okay, if there's going to be a natural end to this particular engagement, how do we set ourselves up to make sure this can be caretaken, have caretaking internally over time? So we need to formulate a workflow. We're figuring that out. We're starting to have those discussions in addition to outreach and collaboration. So we know that this is going to be 1.0 of the ontology, right? How can we engage others and not just providing us feedback and providing his thoughts about how we're going to build our ontology so we can do it appropriately, but maybe using it, maybe helping us build it in the future. And really, thinking about, okay, who in the fraud community can do that? Who outside the fraud community might be interested and involved? So really thinking about that. And again, those are internal discussions we're starting to have, and starting to do a little bit of outreach, including this presentation, and trying to figure out what that's going to look like. And with that, and with, oh dear, 12 minutes left. And I will say I am available to be online a little bit after 1. So if we do have lots of questions, I'm happy to answer. But I just want to thank you, everybody, for listening to my presentation about this project. It's been great working with my colleagues in GAO on this. And I look forward to hearing questions, because we've been talking a lot to people within the fraud realm and not so much with people in the ontology realm. So I'm eager to hear what questions and thoughts you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leah. That was really fascinating. So we have a number of questions on the chat room. You're on chat, so
Yep. Oh,
take a look there.
okay. Let me.
There's Robbie.
1 second. Okay. So
we start with
yeah,
Robbie.
Robbie, go ahead.
Robbie, just unmute.
Hello, Robbie.
You are unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Should we try to go back to him maybe?
Yeah, let's move on to Mike Bennett.
Hi, Leia. Great talk, and I really like you started off with a nice crisp definition of fraud in real world terms. The relationship to a misrepresentation and the intentionality of that misrepresentation, and I can see a nice clean ontology for that. And what I love your thoughts on, I'm intrigued by the relationship between the ontological definition of fraud itself as a thing, and then the data signatures that tell you that some of those real things are there. I think one of the challenges would be, how do you know when some misrepresentation is intentional, for example? So I just wonder what the thinking is in terms of the aboutness of the data versus the reality of fraud itself, and how far along you are in unpacking those kind of thoughts.
That's a great question. Thank you, Mike. How would I approach this? So I would say I think with the mechanism class, if you're looking at a case and you're looking at the mechanism class, and you can see that, okay, there's a false statement. Okay, there's a stolen password. Okay, there's this. Okay, there's that. I think you can get maybe get a sense of that. As far as really specific in process detection with data, I think we're still very, very early in thinking about how you would detect fraud using this ontology kind of in process. So we've done a lot of development about what happens in a fraud scheme, and kind of like what are the mechanism, what are the gears of it, but not as much about fraud indicators, so to speak. So the red flags that people talk about. And I would say maybe some of that you've mentioned would be addressed by some of those more specific red flags. Beyond that, though, Yeah, I would say probably our mechanism class would probably be the most able to kind of speak to those more specific things that really precise data. I will also say my FAIS colleagues might have some thoughts about that as well. I'm not sure if any of you who are on have thoughts as well. And silence is okay
Thank you.
too.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much.
Well, Leah, I don't know if you can hear me. This is Rebecca.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So thank you. That's a great presentation so far. And the only observation I would make about knowing the willful nature aspect of the fraud, we know that that's baked in because we have used the closed cases to develop it. So it has been adjudicated as fraud, by definition involves that willful misrepresentation. So I don't know if that helps. It's not ontological, but it was certainly part of the methodology.
Actually, that does help, and it is very ontological. In artificial intelligence, one of the schools of thought is that nothing has meaning until it's decided by a court of law. So the real challenge for business is not so much fraud, but fraud risk. How do we define the thing before it's the thing? So yeah, it all fits together nicely. Thank you.
Yes.
Great.
Can you hear me now?
Ravi is,
Yes.
we can hear you now.
Good. Thank you. Well, it was nice that Mike asked the first question because I got some clarification from his questions and your answers and the answer provided by your colleague just now. My two basic questions are, how would you maintain the infrastructure? On the expertise, you made a few comments that you people will move on to other tasks and there will be trained teams to take over your position. So there is some kind of notion of continuity of expertise. But what about continuity of infrastructure? That is question number one. Question number two is, if you are basing your model and ontology only on known use cases, then as you know, the fraudsters do change their game. So they involve new technologies, new methods, new things that are not in your model. So how are you going to converge on that going forward?
Thank you, Ravi, for those two great questions. So for first one, as far as infrastructure is concerned, that is definitely also on our radar and things that we're starting to discuss. We have really used Protege and Web Protege quite effectively in collaborating with each other internally on making sure we had working sessions and talking through things. So I'm assuming, and we're probably going to be planning to continue having that as a key part of our infrastructure. I would say also part of our infrastructure is Excel. People love Excel, they know Excel. We're able to export aspects of our ontology into Excel. So using Excel as a way of documenting and reviewing our ontology is also, I think, going to be part of our infrastructure moving forward. What that looks like in combination with the workflow, we're still trying to figure that out a bit, but I think that is probably going to be a continuing continuing infrastructure for us. In regards to maintaining changes as fraudsters come up with new things, that is definitely also part of our discussion. So I would say I think probably a news alert or just general awareness. So the FAIS team is actively always working on engagements, either their own or throughout the agency. They support work with throughout the agency on different engagements about fraud. So they are not only, not only will we be tracking cases coming through, from DOJ or from IGs, but but also just finding out different things through our audit work. So that is probably going to be another way of new cases or new instances of what's going on coming into the ontology. I think, and this is something that the conscious decision that we made, and we talked to MITRE. They have the attack framework, which they specifically do not call it ontology, but it has a lot of ontology-like elements to it. So something that we talked to them about their work, and something that they said is that they really did focus on things that are known. Known instances of cyber security issues, right? Because if they, if you start thinking about everything that's going to happen, well, at what point are you providing information to end users for their creative thought, right? Or, also just scoping, just being able to have an appropriate scope. It's hard to think about all the possibilities and eventualities. You could do that a little bit, but you can't do it to an infinite amount, right? So I would say with our, framework, again, kind of going back to the idea of closed cases, it provides us a framework with some flexibility to fill in the holes and fill in the, tentacles that branch out as new information comes in, but you can't, I think, expand to the universe and try to cap the universe with thinking about new things. It's too challenging, and I think dilutes the effectiveness of the ontology. And Nick, did you want to say something?
No, I think you captured it well. Yeah, I mean, I think one key thing is as you hinted at, was just also not wanting to give fraudsters ideas. That's with MITRE's attack framework, which relates to cybersecurity. They only do things that's sort of already out there. It's already been published. So we'd have to be a little bit careful there. I mean, I do think it's a good point. It's something that we need to think about moving forward. Can we add more value by doing more sort of threat intelligence work? Some avenues of doing that is just honestly monitoring the dark web and see what chat forums, what things people talk about with respect to fraud schemes. I think there's obviously a ton that have popped up associated with COVID. So it's something we need to think about. We just have to be very careful about how we go about doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie.
Todd had a question?
I did?
Yeah, on the chat.
Yeah, Leah, when you were talking about fraud, you seem to be skirting around the thing that the fraud has a subject, or is that not how you modeled it?
So subject, there might be a couple of ways of talking about subject of fraud. So the activity is what we consider the flavor of fraud, or the breed of fraud. So it could be tax fraud, or grant fraud, or visa fraud, or credit card fraud, or all of these different types of fraud. So there's that, and then there's also, I'll finish and then I'll let you jump in. So there's that, and then there's also federal program or operation that's being affected. So there's the student loan program fraud, or fraud in the federal student loan program, or fraud in the visa program, or fraud in contracting practices in a particular agency. So there are different ways of talking about that way, and then there's also the victim, and maybe that's what you're thinking about, who is the ultimate person being exploited or entity being exploited.
Well, let me ask you this question then. In your ontological representation, is fraud considered a process?
So I would say the fraud scheme is a process, and that's something we're still tweaking to fully, maybe not process, maybe situation's the better word for it. It's a thing that has these elements, right?
Right, but doesn't something
So
have to
we're
be done?
working,
Doesn't something have to be done to actually materialize or realize the fraud?
yes, so that is what, so the activity is kind of like what is like the general sense of what is happening. And then the mechanism are the actual tools that are making the fraud happen.
Okay,
So like, right. So like if you're, trying to steal, you're trying to do visa fraud, you might have false documents, and then you might have, a false ID or, something like that, so it's different things that you're doing, like it's different things that you have or processes that you're doing to execute the fraud.
okay, but again, the
Making
fraud is about something or has a subject. Maybe aboutness is a better word, a better notion to use. To you're doing fraud on something or to something, whether it's visa fraud or tax fraud or scamming the National Science Foundation with grants. I mean, I would think the grant is the subject there, or the visa is the subject if you're trying to get a visa illegally, or the tax process, the tax payments, for instance, might be the subject of the fraud or something like that. But
So I think we just have a different approach to our model, and how we're talking about aboutness.
okay, thank you.
Terry has his hand up.
Yes,
Yeah,
I had
thank you.
sort of, I had two related questions.
Who's that?
This is
It's
Gary.
Gary.
Did you say
Go ahead.
Gary or Terry?
I said Terry, but
Go ahead, Gary.
Terry,
Okay, I had my hand up, I think, on the chat.
oh,
Two related questions. One is, this topic is about sustainability of ontology. I have a question about that, but the other is inside the topic is about ontology. Seems to be about the risks to sustainability. So they're related but somewhat separate in my mind. First, on the sustainability of ontologies, do you use something like GitHub to manage your project and your ontologies? These are often used for ontologies where you can track versions and you can track issues on the ontologies. So people have raised a number of issues here. They might go to a site and then put that in, and you would resolve that over time. Do you do anything like that?
So the answer right now is no, because we haven't even reached that stage yet. So this is still like our very first release of this ontology. And a lot of our work so far has been internally working on it with a few key people providing some feedback, but not to a wider breadth. I think down the road, we would probably try to look at GitHub or similar type of setup, but we just haven't reached that yet because we're not at that step of getting that level of feedback or that structure of feedback yet. So I would say I think we could aim to go that route, but we just haven't reached it yet.
Okay.
We haven't even done our 1.0 release.
And so my second question is, inside the domain that you're considering, which involves obviously risk and fraud, which are risks to the sustainability of things like grants and so forth. Do you leverage existing glossaries? There are many glossaries, and this relates to, of course, the definitional track that I represent, where some of the concepts like certification and certifier and chains of custody and a range of things that would be involved in sustainability as modeled in both the environment and manufacturing example. Do you leverage those?
So I would say we have leveraged definitions from other entities. One key part, so I talked about funding stream and revenue stream. The catalog of domestic federal assistance or federal domestic assistance, I can never remember which way it is a government publication that talks about how the federal government interacts with resources, you know, in the domestic space. So we used the specific revenue streams and funding streams that are discussed in that in our ontology. We've done that with, I'm trying to think of other, off the top of my head, other cases where we've done that. MESH, so medical subject headings. Some of the healthcare concepts that we have related to healthcare fraud, we have pulled from MESH. Same thing with ERIC, the ERIC thesaurus, Department of Education database on education literature. We've used terminology from there and adapted it for our ontology. So there, since the federal government is so cross-cutting, there are a lot of different federal sources for terminology that we've drawn upon to be appropriate. But something that we've kind of had to go back and forth with is, you know, sometimes what a federal agency is using as terminology isn't quite appropriate for various reasons, whether it's imprecise or it's not quite the right context, it's inappropriate, you know, we might be tweaking to make sure it's aligning with the structure and the approach of our ontology. So I would say, yes, we've definitely leveraged other vocabularies as appropriate, while still understanding that there's work that we have to do to bring it into our ontology to make it work.
Yes, and I would just note in passing that what you've expressed here, summarized, is the challenge of harmonizing definitions and concepts for particular efforts. So you can start from one area, but you need to, you call them tweak them, but you need to sort of manipulate them for your own uses.
Right. And I think that, you know, that was kind of, it's definitely the key part of this project and kind of the, you know, beginning question and problem is that since there isn't really in the federal government space harmonization about fraud language, and we're trying to work through that, you know, we're going to run into obstacles in some cases while still being able to draw upon resources with some ease in others.
I hope you have time for Terry's question.
Yes, absolutely.
Back to Terry.
Okay, I'm here. I put mine on the chat. Basically, I was wanting to discuss your interaction with other organizations. Do you pursue the fraud cases to their end by yourself or your organization, or do you have to interact with other federal agencies to actually close the loop?
So I will say, I'll start and then let my colleagues chime in. So as far as fraud cases for this engagement, we've really focused on just looking at either looking at the press releases or the semi-annual reports, or going to PACER and pulling down court documents and looking through and making a determination that way with our colleague Sabrina and our Office of General Counsel. As far as following up fraud cases, just in general in FAIS work, I will let my colleagues answer that question because I think it's a great one.
And I'd like to see how it gets into how the feedback gets to your ontology from the actual pursuit of the cases.
Heather, did you want to initially take this, or do you want me to answer? I'm actually not even sure. Actually, I think I might be the only one on still with FAS. So we've pretty much everything we refer on to the appropriate agencies. So let's say we will get a response through our hotline, which is referred to as FraudNet, which Leia spoke with at the beginning of the presentation. Typically, all that goes to the associated responsible inspector general's office. We will also sometimes uncover fraud through our engagement work. So for example, we'll do some data mining and determine, someone who doesn't seem like they should be eligible for a particular government benefit. We'll do maybe a little bit of digging, but that typically all goes then to the responsible, whatever the agency is. For this engagement, I think it's worth noting that we are looking at closed cases. So it's all stuff that was primarily coming from Department of Justice. So it's cases that I don't think we touched any of the ones that are actually in our ontology right now.
Okay,
and I will say that also that has added a level of challenge to it, because I think the information consistency that we've come across varies dramatically. One part of information that we did to feed into the ontology was look over Inspector General semi-annual reports, which are these required reports that every Inspector General has to put out. And a lot of them include good summary information related to investigations, but those summaries can vary like massively. So sometimes they'll write paragraphs, other times there will be a sentence, not even really a complete sentence. So that was another kind of like challenging piece, is we're really subject to other people's work, but also how they've chosen to describe their work.
So we're running a little over, but this is really a fascinating topic. Getting back to the issue of sustainability, though, it seems to me that in order for an ontology to be sustainable, the stakeholders have to feel that there is value in continuing to support it. So how do you go about establishing or convincing all the various users of your ontology that there is value in maintaining it after you've finished developing it?
Right. So I would say internally, there's definitely an appetite, thankfully. Our management has been really enthusiastic about its use for the case tracking that I mentioned towards the end of our presentation. Nick mentioned, there's been a lot of fraud cases that have happened with COVID, and that's some of the tracking we're doing right now. So seeing how that is supporting that work, people are internally excited and interested in seeing how we can continue to grow this and build capacity for it. So I think internally we're okay. We're having to figure out what it's going to look like and how we're going to make it happen. But the interest and the support for it is there. Externally is a different story, because we're still doing this like an initial information and outreach and capacity building externally to let people know we were doing this work and be ready for when it gets released, because we want people externally to test it and use it and give us feedback on it. But we're still trying to figure out what that looks like, and I think that is a key question for us, because we want we set up how to do this work to benefit the larger fraud community in the federal government, and actually beyond that, right? Because we wanted harmonized information. We wanted a harmonized baseline for people to report out fraud so people understand what's going on in a comprehensive and complete way. So doing that, outreach work, doing that work to make sure it's sustainable for people externally is of great importance, and really important for us, in addition to our own internal use. I think our own internal use it's going to continue. What that looks like workflow wise remains to be seen. I think externally there are a lot of more question marks, and we're still trying to work through that, and we're going to try to work through what mechanisms, what ways that we can do to make sure we have a platform and have a framework for letting external stakeholders, external collaborators support this work.
So when you say platform, do you mean actual tools that they would use?
Perhaps, but I think right now we're at the point where we're just trying to decide whom are the appropriate stakeholders, and then what are the expectations of that collaboration? Is it material support where they were going to actually edit and update aspects of the ontology? Is it going to be just more higher level, like, we like this class, you need to add this, you need to edit this, kind of in a general sense? Or is it just kind of like quarterly update meetings? Like, what does that look like? I think we need to quantify that and quantify the stakeholders first before we even think about like the material platform or like conduit for that collaboration. But yes, that is going to be part of it, but I think that's a few steps ahead. And I think I maybe and unintentionally said that was like that was a first step. It isn't. I unintentionally implied that. It's definitely a couple steps down.
Oh, but you definitely recognize it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And
It's
that's
just
that's perhaps the most important, is
right.
that you recognize that this is something that would be necessary for sustainability.
Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, as I say, we've already gone quite far over. But I think it was really worth it. Thank you so much. This was a great introduction to sustainability and to the GAO. It's very impressive what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for my colleagues who were on the phone and listening in. And thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your participation. There were some really valuable questions. And so I hope to see you next week. Let's see, what is next week? We're back to track A, the ontological landscape. Todd, do you have anything to say about, or you're still here? I guess Todd isn't here.
Todd has gone.
Oh,
but
Ravi,
Mike,
can you tell us what's happening?
Mike Ushol will be talking next 21st April, I believe.
Okay, I hope to see everyone next week for Mike Ushel, who is talking about commercial ontology development. So with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
And bye.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.